I had already been a doula for 4 years, supporting other women through their birth experience. So I knew that motherhood would change everything. I knew that I was going to have to learn how to change dirty diapers and make really, really strong coffee. What I didn't realize was that motherhood would change everything. In those late nights, sleepless nights, I turned to my journal to try to make sense of the changes that had happened to me in my life. I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. There was something so primal about those early days that had me questioning who I was and what mattered most to me. I was in this liminal space, this part of me that I had left behind. I was not that anymore, not the woman I was before I became a mother, and yet not quite this, not quite yet fully embodied in my motherhood. It was as if I was unraveling myself to see what I was made of, so that I could begin to weave myself anew. Up until that point in my life, it was as if I had been born with a ladder in my hands. And I would hoist that ladder up against the various walls of my choosing, and I would climb to the top. I had 2 degrees, 2 full passports, and even a world record to show for it. But on that night that I became a mother, motherhood took a match to that ladder and watched it burn. The first thing to go was my job. Actually, that's not quite true. The first thing to go were the high heels. Yeah. The business casual slacks. The pearl earrings. The friendships based on frivolity and gossip, and every single social engagement that had my inner introvert squirming. As I began to unravel myself, I wove myself anew. I started to write again. I had always been a writer as a kid. In fact, I remember being in grade 5, huddled in the corner of the dodgeball court, fending off flying balls as I penned my first novel. It was a 200-page long, impossible story about a ghost and a girl, handwritten on loose-leaf pages and bound in a turquoise and red binder that I would hand to my best friend every night. She was my editor. She would give it back to me the next day for corrections. And so, in those early days of trying to figure out all of these changes to my life, I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I looked back at one of the biggest and most significant ladders that I had ever tried to climb in my life. It was a decade-long, singularly focused attempt to get into medical school and become a doctor. It ended up being the first and most significant failure of my life. But I was able to look back on that and started to wonder if there was something I could do for a career that would allow me to be in a healing way with people, in a way that I had intuitive, I'd always meant to do, even way back as a child. And so, as I wrote and wrote and wrote, I wrote a business plan. And during these months and years, really, I was still a doula. I was still supporting women in birth. And I started to notice that it wasn't just me who was going through this massive reorientation. There was something about motherhood, maybe, that catalyzed this desire to understand who we were and what mattered most to us. And because I've always been a bit of a researcher, I decided to ask other women in my community if they could resonate with this experience as well. And it turned out that it was women everywhere. Women everywhere were questioning who they were and what mattered most to them. Now, back in those early days of motherhood, I read a book. It was called Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And I remember the copy that I had of it was enormous. And I would sit it on my breastfeeding pillow, hoping not to wake the baby as I slowly turned the pages and devoured every word. The book is a collection of stories and myths of the wild woman archetype. The wild woman. I began to connect the dots between my experience and the experience of the other women in my community, who were all rethinking everything that we thought we knew. The book says that to be oneself is often to be exiled from many others, but to comply with the wishes of others is to exile from yourself. The book says a woman deprived of a deep and meaningful soul life may look combed and cleaned up on the surface, but on the inside, she is filled with pleading hands and gaping mouths. So I realized that this series of changes that I and the women in my community were making to our lives weren't just a series of random life changes. No, they were about us reclaiming something within us that had been lost. For me, it was about opting out of the hustle that had me too busy and with no energy to hear my own inner knowing. I began to slow down. I started to tend to myself and the community of women around me. I started to knit and weave, not just with yarn, but a new story for myself. And I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. And I realized that on the day that I birthed my daughter, with an outcry that at the time felt so uncontrolled, that really that outcry was my wild. And I realized that on the day that I birthed my daughter, that I stepped into the rite of passage that is the transition to motherhood. But at the same time, I stepped into a different kind of rite of passage that has women everywhere raising their hand and saying, "Me too." I realized on the day that I birthed my daughter that I also